Hi, I'm Chris Hay, and I'm an independent consultant working with researchers from Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota, as well as the Iowa Soybean Association, on a project advancing the conservation drainage practices of saturated buffers and bioreactors. One of the goals of this project was to develop some resources for farmers and landowners who have adopted these practices to help provide some more guidance on how to manage them. So we've put together a series of videos, along with a printed guide and some online resources to assist with that. This video then talks about how to find and manage the Stoplog settings for your saturated buffer or bioreactor. A previous video discussed the types of stoplogs and control structures used for these practices, so you may want to watch that first to help in understanding your stoplog settings. When we talk about stoplog settings, we're talking about the combination of stoplogs needed to get the desired settings to match the design specs for the practice. So in this example, there is a bottom board that is 7 inches, another 7-inch stoplog, then 3 5-inch stoplogs for a total of 29 inches. To find the stoplog settings for your individual practices, most saturated buffers and bioreactors will come with an operations and maintenance plan, typically using an NRCS format. If there isn't an NRCS O&M plan that came with your design, there should be some other document with the stoplog settings. There are generally 3 different ways that the stoplog settings will be reported. The first is the measurement from the top rim of the control structure to the top of the highest stoplog. This is most convenient for field checking that the stoplog settings are correct because it can be quickly done just using a tape measure. A second method is the height of the stoplogs above the bottom of the control structure. And then the third method is just to give the number of 5-inch and 7-inch stoplogs needed to get the stoplog setting. This is most convenient when you're actually putting stoplogs in from scratch, since the other 2 methods require a little math to figure out what the actual combination should be. In the 3 chamber control structures typically used for saturated buffer and bioreactor inlets, the stoplogs that divert flow into the saturated buffer or bioreactor are the downstream stoplogs, which go in the stoplogs tracks farthest from the field or closest to the outlet. The upstream tracks closest to the field, also called the field side control, are only used where drainage water management is used in addition to the saturated buffer or bioreactor. So this won't apply to most saturated buffers or bioreactors unless you specifically requested a drainage water management plan as well. However, it is a good idea to leave a bottom board in these upstream tracks. Another important piece of information in your operations and management plan is whether your site uses year-round stoplog settings or if it needs seasonal management. The most preferred sites for saturated buffers and bioreactors are ones where the ground elevation at the control structure is a few feet lower than the lowest elevation in the field. In that case, raising the stoplogs in the control structure to divert water into the buffer or bioreactor won't negatively impact drainage in the field. So, for year-round management sites, the stoplog settings can generally be considered as set it and forget it because the stoplog settings will rarely, if ever, need to be changed. For flatter sites, raising the stoplogs will have an impact on drainage in the field, so the stoplog settings will need to be changed at key times during the year to make sure the field is suitable for planting and harvest and to prevent damage to the crop. So starting right after harvest, with seasonal management, the stoplogs will be raised to their highest setting since drainage isn't needed over the non-growing season. Then approximately 2 weeks before planting, stoplogs will need to be removed to drain the field to prepare for planting. This will typically mean removing all of the stoplogs. Then approximately another 2 weeks after planting, the stoplogs will be raised again, but typically not as high as in the non-growing season settings. This growing season setting is designed to balance getting some treatment from the saturated buffer or bioreactor while minimizing the risk of crop damage. However, since it's not in full drainage, conditions should be monitored during the growing season because some stoplogs may need to be temporarily removed following big storm events or during other particularly wet periods during the growing season. Then, approximately 2 weeks before harvest, if it's a wet fall and there's water in the control structure, the stoplogs can be removed to put the system back in full drainage to drain the field for harvest. But if it's a dry fall, the system can just stay at the growing season settings. And then once harvest is complete, the stop log should be raised back to the non-growing season setting. So let's take a look at some examples of finding the stop log settings. First, for a saturated buffer with year-round settings. Your exact plan may look a little different depending on what state you're in, but it should have a section similar to this with those stop log settings. So this one indicates that the stop log settings are maintained year-round. And there's a blank for use if drainage water management is being used to manage drainage from the field. However, as discussed previously, this will not apply to most saturated buffers unless you specifically requested a drainage water management plan along with your saturated buffer. The next blank then is where the stop log setting is shown for diverting water into the saturated buffer distribution pipe. For this example, the stop log setting is given as 24 inches as measured from the top rim of the control structure. For saturated buffers that do require seasonal management, a table similar to the one here will then be used to show those stop log settings. Then, as in this example, the approximate dates that the stop log settings should be changed are shown. The actual dates will then vary depending on typical planting and harvest dates for your area, and they can be adjusted depending on the timing within any given year. Then the corresponding stop log settings are shown. In this example, 24 inches below the top of the control structure during the non-growing or fallow season, and 36 inches during the growing or crop season, and then fully open around planting and again as needed prior to harvest. For bioreactors, the stop log settings will look very similar, except that there will be a setting for both the inlet and the outlet. Usually these will be separate control structures, but sometimes a combined 4-chamber control structure is used to control both the inlet and the outlet. For this example with year-round stop log settings, the stop log settings are shown with all three methods, so distance from the top of the structure, height above the bottom of the structure, and the number of 5 and 7-inch stop logs. For both the inlet or upstream structure and the outlet or downstream structure. Similar to the earlier saturated buffer example, the stop log settings for this bioreactor are given in a table, with the timing for making the stop log changes and the associated stop log settings for both the bioreactor inlet and the outlet. As discussed previously, depending on whether you're just double-checking your stop log settings or adding or removing stop logs, one method of thinking about the stop log settings may be easier to use than another. Fortunately, there are some conversion tables that, with one stop log setting value, allow you to find the other values based on the height of your control structure. So using the control structure height and the distance below the stop log setting, you can find the stop log height from the bottom and the corresponding number of 7-inch and 5-inch stop logs that are needed. So taking a look at an example for a 5-foot tall control structure and a stop log setting of 21 inches below the top, using this table, you would go to the column for the 5-foot control structure and then read down until you find 21 inches below the top. Then you would read across horizontally to find the stop log height is 39 inches. And that this can be done with 2 7-inch stop logs and 5 5-inch stop logs. Another tool that can be helpful with understanding stop log settings is the Stoplog Settings tool from the Iowa Soybean Association. With this tool and using the slider to change the stop log height, the tool will then tell you the corresponding number of 7-inch and 5-inch stop logs and then show that combination graphically as well. This tool can be found on the ISA website under Research and Results, and then selecting the Drainage Calculators category. Another resource for information on saturated buffers and bioreactor management, including stop log settings, is the Practice Management page at the Conservation Drainage Network website. This includes links to the ISA stop log tool and those stop log conversion tables. You can also find this information from the Soil and Water Conservation Society's website and their conservation media library by scrolling down to find the section on managing water control structures. So thanks for watching. Hopefully this video is giving you a better understanding of how to find and work with your stop log settings for your saturated buffer or bioreactor. Companion video gives more information on the different types of stop logs and control structures, and so that can be useful with this to help understand those stop log settings. Again, for more information and resources to help with managing your saturated buffer bioreactor, check out the other videos in this series, as well as visiting the Conservation Drainage Network at conservationdrainage.net.